Let me first start out by thanking the organizers of this event this weekend. Thanks for the invite, and to thank the traditional people from the region for allowing us to say what we've come here to say. When I think of September the 11th, that date, the very first date that comes to mind historically is the brutal assassination of Salvador Allende, democratically elected president of Chile, and the U.S.'s CIA-backed interest in having him deposed and assassinated. I've been involved in a number of incidents that have become somehow significant on that particular day, September the 11th. One of those incidents was the infamous insurrection at Attica State Prison in 1971, and the other was the infamous uprising at Gustafsen Lake in 1995. And I think, for the sake of this conference, when we're thinking about 9/11, 9/11 of what happened in New York, the toppling of the Twin Towers, the murder of 3,000 people, I think we have to understand that in contemporary terms, this is visualized and used by the power, by the oligarchies and the plutocrats to advance an anti-terrorist agenda, when in fact, we're going to have to come to the realization that what happened on 9/11 was not an outside job, it was an inside job. And we're going to have to come to the grips with the fact that they told us exactly what they were going to do. They wrote a document called the Project for a New American Century. PNAC is the acronym. That particular document is sort of the child from the mother document known as the Grand Chessboard, which was written by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the founder for David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission. And in that particular book, it basically critiques in 122 pages how they intend, the Western powers intend, to put themselves in the Mideast and to secure all of the natural resources from oil to natural gas to all the mineral rights in the Mideast. They had the nerve to tell us point blank through these two basic documents that they were in fact going to need an excuse to justify an incursion internationally in order to get the American people and the Canadian people and the civilized people of the Western Hemisphere to justify this massive incursion, which was going to cost millions of lives. In doing so, enacting a theater of wars, conducting a theater of wars simultaneously. And Dick Cheney, in May of 2001, put together his national energy policy, where he sat down with representatives from Exxon, Mobil, Shell, BP, and all of the Western consortiums. And he came down with one basic axiom: national security equals energy security equals national security. The supply of oil in the world is rapidly depleting. We are reaching peak oil proportions. The global agenda is to seize the oil. The oligarchies or the oligarchies want the oil, want the resources. Therefore, they're employing the military to get out there and to seize this oil. But in order to justify it to the American people or the Canadian people or the good people of Great Britain, they have to make it look like it was an attack in the Project for a New American Century. It very discreetly says that in order to justify an incursion, the only way that we could justify it to the civilized populations would be to conduct a modern day Pearl Harbor catastrophe. Now, coincidentally, 9/11 happens. Please, let's not get locked up into calling someone who might think in this way that it was an inside job a conspiracy theorist, because there is nothing more conspiratorial than to blame it on 19 Saudis, 10 of them who are still raising their hands over in Pakistan and saying, "Hi, I'm still alive. I'm not dead." It's racism for us to accept that it was Arabs that conducted this massive operation at 9/11. It's a racist subconscious proposition to accept it, that it was somebody from the Mideast that conducted this massive military operation. It was an inside job, and the sooner that we come to grips with that, the sooner we can begin to arrest those criminals and bring them before a war crimes tribunal and make them answerable to the world for the crimes that they've committed of mass murder and genocide. And now, while we're on the subject of genocide, let's talk about who the number one terrorist in the world is. If it isn't the United States, if it isn't the European genocidal policies of the killing of over 100 million Indian peoples of the Western Hemisphere, what in fact is the definition of a terrorist? Given the sake of time, I think it's necessary to do a 101, a historical 101 on the question of the rule of law in the Western Hemisphere, let's say, versus the rule of force. Historically, in 1497, when the New World and the newcomers came to this continent, there was a papal bull that was issued called Terra Nullius. And that papal bull basically said that the indigenous populations were not human beings, that they were a dark-skinned, delightful-looking people, but they were on par with the four-legged animals of the woods. Therefore, they didn't have the intelligence, or we didn't have the intelligence to enter into negotiations or treaties relevant to making treaties for property relationships to acquire our lands. Therefore, they were given a moral justification to utilize troops in order to kill Indians on the same par that you would any four-legged animal of the woods. Historically, hundreds of thousands of native peoples were being brutally murdered, and in the process of that murder, there happened to be a person by the name of Bartholomew de las Casas, who was witnessing the outright massacre of many thousands of Mayans and Inca peoples in Central America. He petitioned Pope Paul III in 1532 to rescind the original 1497 papal bull Terra Nullius, and subsequently declaring that indigenous people were human beings of high intelligence and able to enter into property relationships. Subsequently, in 1490 or in 1537, Pope Paul rescinded that 1497 papal bull with a papal bull called Sublimis Deus, recognizing indigenous peoples had the right to own and control our own territories and to defend ourselves against any further colonial encroachment. And at that point, they were forced. This became the basis of modern day or contemporary law, known as the 1763 Royal Proclamation, also which was validated by a 1704 Queen Anne's decision that came down in a case known as the state of Connecticut versus the Mohegan Indians. And in that case, the Mohegan Indians challenged the state of Connecticut, who thought they had the right to seize millions of acres of unsurrendered Indian land. They petitioned at that time Queen Anne to intervene as a third-party tribunal, or as a third party to intervene on the whole question of title. She put together the Privy Council, which came together and ordered an ordering council years later and ruled in favor of the Mohegan. That particular law was never rescinded or repealed and stands as international law today. That same law, moving down fast, given the time constraints here, that same law was validated after the massive military campaign of Pontiac and thousands of warriors in the Northern Hemisphere here against the Crown, Great Britain, when King George was forced to acknowledge the sovereignty and the self-determination of indigenous populations according to the original papal bulls of 1532, the Sublimis Deus, and subsequently the 1704 Queen Anne's Ordering Council. And in the 1763 Royal Proclamation, it states all lands belonging to indigenous people should be left unmolested and undisturbed. And the only way that we, meaning the Crown, can purchase this land is either by direct surrender of the land or by financial purchase. And if that's work done on international levels, then title was still vested in the indigenous populations. Thus, you have international law, then moving very fast in history to 1982, you have this country in the Canadian Constitution under Section 35 recognizing the supreme law of the land and enshrining the 1763 Royal Proclamation, international recognition of self-determination and sovereignty of the indigenous populations under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. Now, all that said, what we are living in with today is the fact that there is still a law that recognizes that we are self-determining sovereign people. And any nations of people throughout all of Canada or the United States are still sovereign peoples in control of our own sovereign land and resources and constantly engaging in struggle with colonial interest upon our lands, mostly for material acquisition, for the resources. And that's where they utilize the rule of force in order to acquire through military campaigns our resources, just like they are now doing it with the justification of 9/11 in Iraq, hundreds of thousands murdered in Fallujah, in soon to be Iran. They're going to use the excuse that they're trying to put down the Bushehr reactor plant. And they're going to try to challenge 400,000 specially trained Iranians. They can't do nothing right now with the Iraqis. They definitely are not going to beat the Iranians. Let's hope they don't. Because I support the resistance in Iraq. I support the resistance in Iran. I support the resistance in Afghanistan, soon to be in Venezuela, in Cuba, and all around the world, and in Palestine. I support resistance wherever resistance is raised. There was a judge in Portland, Oregon, a woman by the name of Janice Stewart, who in 1995 ruled in an extradition application that was made. Professor Anthony Hall and myself put together and formulated all the law on international constitutional law and submitted it before this judge on behalf of a brother by the name of James Pitawanakwat, who was one of the defenders up at Gustafsen Lake in 1995. And they were trying to extradite him back to Canada to face further criminalization of charges on possessions of weapon, of a shotgun. And he did not want to be extradited. He called me up, and subsequently I told him that he should tell the judge he refuses to be extradited back to Canada. And that you want hearings to that effect immediately, and that if your lawyer is not willing to argue that, fire him right away, and I'll act amicus curiae. Or not really, it's called a friend to the court, and I'm not really a friend to the court, but I would assess him. Because as far as I'm concerned, the courts only have the assumption of jurisdiction in unsurrendered Indian land. Well, they do. They do. That's colonialism. It's colonialism, to assume that you have the right to judge anything I do in unsurrendered lands. That's colonialism. It's racist, and it's a part of the genocidal, ongoing assimilative genocidal policies of the colonial powers that be. In any event, she, for the sake of time, ruled in a 30-page decision that we had the right to defend that territory in an armed defensive posture at Gustafsen Lake in 1995 because Canada was illegally occupying Indian lands in violation of the law I just explained to you on international constitutional levels. And she then said she doesn't understand why the lawyer Leonard Peltier never utilized that same law to keep him from being extradited back to the U.S. on the falsified information by a woman by the name of Myrtle Poorbear. Then she went on to say we had the right to defend that territory in unsurrendered Indian lands because in the same way that the Palestinians defend themselves against Israeli aggression, the Tamil Tigers and the IRA. This is a 30-page decision, which is a landmark decision. There's an author by the name of Gary Betts from over here that's written a book recently and said it was one of the most astounding landmark decisions of all times on the question of extradition. I told him, don't you dare. Under Article 4 of that extradition treaty, it says that if you believe that what you did was a political charge, a crime of political nature, as opposed to a criminal nature, you had the right to fight extradition. We unequivocally proved that Ujjal Assange manufactured lies about shootouts that never happened up at Gustafsen Lakes in order to justify an incursion. I put him right in the hot seat, right in before the media, and made him basically agree that he was lying. Lying! We took the whole propaganda machinery during 1995 and showed you the law that we stood on, and showed you we were trying to live by the rule of law, international and constitutional in nation. We showed you that we were lied to by the state, and they wanted to suppress this uprising on the question of title. If it was to seep into other nations, could get very contagious, to just move straight along. And indigenous populations, throwing off the yoke of colonialism in unsurrendered Indian land. So they definitely had to put an end to that. But the point I'm making here today is that now, as far as the rule of law is concerned, in the interest of the globalization forces, now, according to this Gary Betts, that same law that we made for Gustafsen Lake 10 years ago, but just recently in this decision, now Canada and the United States are saying we will no longer argue this kind of point in a court of law. From now on, it will be a matter just before the two justice departments of both countries. So what does the rule of law mean? They just threw it all out the back door to justify their ongoing incursion into unsurrendered Indian lands. And then I must say that what happened on September the 11th in 1995 is that the Canadian government unlaunched over 75,000 rounds of bullets in an attempt to kill a handful of indigenous peoples up at Gustafsen Lake. Now, nobody was killed, and so you have to say to yourself, well, geez, they must be some pretty bad shots. And a handful of basically exposed people defending unsurrendered territories in accordance to international and constitutional laws. But I am here to tell you today that the reason that they did not kill them is because we were effective in getting you to see the lie and to say, no will do, no will kill. We were able to expose the lies and show that they were using it to demonize us to justify the kill. Subsequently, we put the fear in that event. I know specifically, when you look at their documents inside of the book that I wrote, and their documents intelligence report says splitting the sky may very well have warrior societies surrounding us. If you shoot at any of the defenders inside of the camp, if you shoot at them, shoot over their heads, because we've been told by splitting the sky, if anybody gets killed up there, there is going to be an all-out war across this country. And so they were scared enough not to kill anybody. So when I think of September the 11th, I think of people could have been murdered on that day. People could have all been dead if it hadn't been for the work that I and others had done to stop that massacre in contemporary times. And I am reminded of what we fought for. I am reminded for the many peoples that are survivors of the residential schools, including myself and people sitting right in this office, in this room here this evening, the torture and the murders that were committed. But I'm also reminded of being 19 years old as an urban Indian that was inside of one of the infamous prisons in 1971, being the only person convicted for allegedly killing a cop during the 1971 Attica standoff rebellion, which of course we showed later that when we took the prison on September 9th, 1971, we had to liberate the gates, and cast iron gates. They had four of them closed off, and we ripped those gates out of the wall. And the gate came down and hit this guy in the head. He died 2 days later on September the 11th. At that point, New York State ordered in 1,000 state troopers. On September the 13th, they came in that morning with every kind of assault rifle you could possibly think of. And like a turkey shoot, state troopers on top of that prison, they let out over 40,000 rounds of bullets. And I watched people being shot, bludgeoned to death, heads exploding, guts falling out, guards taking guns and shoving it down their throats and blowing people's brains out, shoving it up people's anuses and shooting people, stripping them naked, making people crawl and beg for their lives, throwing people inside of trenches that we use to defecate and urinate in, and put their hands execution style and put guns to the back of their heads and executed people. Over 43 people were murdered in cold blood. Over 200 people were wounded and maimed for life. So when I think of these days, I think of resistance. I see that there were 61 of us that were indicted during that time. Rockefeller tried to suppress any of this information going to a second grand jury when he was facing confirmation hearings as Vice President of the United States under Gerald Ford. He tried to get the Bureau of Criminal Investigation to suppress any information going to a second grand jury about the murders that were committed on September the 11th, September the 13th at Attica State Prison. Given the time constraints, this is what I think about when I think about September the 11th. That's just off the cuff of my head at this moment. I have thought about that, these dates that seem to coincide, and I can tell you one thing. We had better not believe the lies of this imperialist colonial beast, because they have utilized 9/11 and 3,000 bodies in New York. And by the way, I happened to be there the day before promoting my book on the 30th anniversary of Attica. On the 30th anniversary of Attica. I was promoting my book at a place called SOB's. I guess that's apropos, but I was there just 2 blocks up the way from the Twin Towers. And I know that the Thomas Keane Commission was a blue ribbon scam commission. Because they had people, when they brought up the question of FEMA being there in the 200s, over 200 FEMA agents were there the day before. The commission said they weren't there. I can tell you, I seen them in the same hotels I was in for 10 days. I seen them all come in, and I seen every FEMA agent ready to conduct an operation that was put out by one of my nemesis, political nemesis, Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, who used me as a political leverage in a campaign against the woman that he was going up against in his second bid for mayor of New York. But I know that there was an operation known as Operation Tripod, and that was done up in May of 2001, months before 9/11 happened, that on September the 12th, FEMA was supposed to conduct an operation drill in case any buildings were blown up or anybody was hit with anthrax type chemical agents. Now, is that a coincidence? No, because the command center that he had at the World Trade Number 7, which was fortified in offices now on the 23rd floor, the Office of Emergency Management, which was operated through FEMA, that was so totally fortified, it was used with the computers to guide in remote control drones to hit the Twin Towers, that they wouldn't be touched. When the Twin Towers went down, they slid over to Pier 92 in the New York Harbor, which was the new command center under Operation Tripod. Coincidence? Coincidence? Is it coincidence? You call me a conspiratorial theorist, I'll call you a coincidental theorist. I'd rather be a conspiratorial theorist than a coincidental theorist. Because there is not that much coincidence in the world. To think that the U.S. imperialist, capitalist beast is not able to conduct such military inside operations is to give your enemy just way too much. Thank you very much.